I highly doubt that anyone's clicking on this video with no idea who either Martin Luther King or Malcolm X are. The former is perhaps the best known American of the 20th century, while the latter has started to feature more prominently in pop culture and even has a Netflix special. And the general sentiment is this: Martin Luther King's the fan favourite and the hero of history who everyone can get behind, while on the other hand, Malcolm X was something of an anti-hero who was more of a renegade figure and not really for public consumption. Unfortunately, most of that commentary is a series of generic statements that don't use either Malcolm or Martin's words, or if they do, it's usually that one line about people being judged by the content of their character and not the colour of their skin. Now, that's not wrong, but imagine if someone tried to characterise a lifetime of your beliefs by one sentence that you said. So let's try and dispel the myths and look at their beliefs, issue by issue.
Hello there.
Okay, so do make sure to subscribe. On Saturdays we have our History of Modern China series and our Enemies of the West series, so subscribe to become an expert in understanding the context of the world around us. Now, when it comes to pinpointing the beliefs of both of these guys, it's not as simple as comparing, say, religions. There's obviously no creed of Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X changed his position significantly as he aged in life. But there are two speeches that come the closest to a codified set of beliefs that each held. For Martin Luther King, it's the I Have a Dream speech, but for Malcolm X, it's the speech he made in the same year, 1963, when he was in Detroit. So these are the two speeches we'll be drawing heavily upon, and so just to let you know where we're headed, these are the 5 positions we're going to look at today. Number 1, their views on the plight of black people. Number 2, their views on white people. Number 3, differences in their quest for a revolution. Number 4, their perspective on integration. And then lastly, their view on non-violence as a viable strategy. But before we even get to that, let's just get a quick snapshot of each of their lives. And if you feel like you know their lives inside out, skip to this point here. So Martin Luther King was a pastor who more or less had leadership thrust upon him. After the first day of the successful Montgomery bus boycott, for the boycott to be sustained, it needed organisation and leadership. And by chance, a bit of rivalry between the frontrunners for leadership, Edgar Nixon and Rufus Lewis, meant that neither of them took leadership of the movement, and that left a space for Dr. King to enter. His fantastic oratory skills, which he honed as a preacher, ensured that he kept people motivated to continue walking to work, and this elevated him to the leading voice in the civil rights movement. As the leader, he campaigned for the end of segregation laws and was the final speaker in the March on Washington, a campaign to press Congress to pass JFK's Civil Rights Bill. And at the end of his life, Martin Luther King devoted most of his attention to economic issues and the issue of wealth disparity in America before being assassinated in 1968. Alternatively, Malcolm X was a highly intelligent student who became involved in something of a crime ring and went to jail. And in jail, he converted to Islam and became part of the Nation of Islam. Far from a mainstream Islamic sect, this sect had a particular focus on black Americans as a chosen people of Allah who needed to have their diaspora ended in the same way that the Jews of the Old Testament were waiting for their exile to end in Babylon. Malcolm X went on to criticize Martin Luther King as being soft, and his more aggressive oratory style resonated with many black Americans. Now, after discovering that the Nation of Islam's leader, Elijah Muhammed, was abusing his position of power and effectively committing statutory rape against teenage girls, he distanced himself from the organisation and went on a pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, this pilgrimage actually seems to have really changed him, and he became much more sympathetic to the ideology of Martin Luther King and softened his more hardline stance. In 1965, Malcolm X said that the Nation of Islam were trying to kill him, and then 2 days later he was indeed assassinated, with 3 people from the Nation of Islam convicted for roles in his murder. Now, I'm not going to enter any of the conspiracy theory territory. So firstly, we'll start with how they were similar, and unsurprisingly, they shared a pretty common perspective on the plight of black Americans. For Dr. King, this was in fact made most clear at the beginning of his I Have a Dream speech, where he argued that, yeah, black slaves may have been emancipated 100 years beforehand, but that black people were hardly free in the 1960s due to segregation laws. Malcolm X held this view too, but focused less on the chains of legalized segregation, and more on the lack of pride in themselves that black Americans held. For example, in a speech that he made in Detroit in 1963, Malcolm X said, "You didn't come here on the Mayflower. You came here on a slave ship, in chains like a horse or a cow or a chicken, and you were brought here by the people who came here on the Mayflower." For Malcolm X, black Americans had been second-class citizens from the moment their ancestors stepped foot onto their slave ship, and that even if laws were to be changed, societally they were still second-class citizens to white people. And so for Malcolm X, he wanted to build a proud identity for black Americans to elevate them out of the second class. In fact, the Nation of Islam went even further, arguing that Allah's first created humans were the dark-skinned Shabazz tribe, who possessed a sense of divinity that no other group of people had. Secondly, the two differed on their perspective of white people, at least for a large portion of their public lives. For Martin Luther King, white people were never the enemy, and in fact, he went to lengths to gain the support of white people so that the movement would not appear as something imposed upon white people from African Americans. He also recognized the reality that in the highest offices, it was white people who held the power, and any inflammatory rhetoric would likely alienate the support of the Kennedys, who he'd worked pretty hard to build a partnership with. Many people forget that at the end of his life, his attention shifted towards economic issues, and he became a huge advocate for the white lower classes. In his Poor People's Campaign, he flat out said that he wanted to assemble a multiracial army of the poor. And even as early as his I Have a Dream speech, in 1963, King said that many white people had come to realise that their destiny is our destiny. Alternatively, for most of Malcolm X's public life, he held quite a different view. In that same Detroit speech, Malcolm X labelled the white man as an enemy to all of us, and also famously labelled them as blue-eyed devils. This came from a systemic perspective of things. For Malcolm X, all white people had profited off the oppression of black people. You could be a white liberal in the South, but you still benefited from generational wealth from the slave trade, and you also weren't looked down upon in society. He was also born Malcolm Little, but replaced his surname with a placeholder X because for him, Little was a slave name given to his ancestors. This was in line with the Nation of Islam's view of white people as the race of oppressors, with Christianity as its primary tool of oppression. However, once Malcolm X started to distance himself from the Nation of Islam, and after he went to Mecca and saw multiracial worship, he backtracked from his more hardline stance and instead saw Islam as a way to unify all races rather than to fight back against the white race. Thirdly, Martin Luther King had no intention of creating a new system, he simply wanted to reform the old one. In the I Have a Dream speech, he actually did make reference to this and used the word revolt in a negative context, saying, "The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges." However, for Malcolm X, he literally advocated for a separate black nation which would have land in the South, arguing, revolution is based on land. Land is the basis of all independence, land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality. He even mocked the integrationist efforts by saying that desegregated lunch counters were no revolution. And given their views on revolution, you can probably guess their views on integration, but I think these two quotes perfectly capture it. Martin Luther King said, "With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day." To Malcolm X's, it's just like when you've got some coffee that's too black, which means it's too strong. What you do? You integrate it with cream, you make it weak. If you pour too much cream in, you won't even know you ever had coffee. I really don't think that needs any more analysis from me. Finally, King and Malcolm X differed on their views on non-violent resistance. Martin Luther King was an avid supporter of non-violence and went to lengths to encourage demonstrators to remain non-violent. Now this was for two reasons. Number one, it aligned closely with his Christian ideology and his understanding of Jesus. And secondly, seeing violent attacks such as those on the Freedom Riders met with a non-violent response was an effective picture to paint in terms of who were the heroes and who were the villains. On the other hand, Malcolm X found that approach to be weak and argued that it was ineffective. When commenting on the March on Washington, Malcolm X argued that King's demonstrators lost their anger and their militancy. Malcolm X had a Nation of Islam militia who accompanied him, and the militia were taught to never violently attack, but if they were to be attacked, they were right to use violence as self-defense. For Malcolm, this would make people rightfully afraid to target black people in America. Ironically, once Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam, he lost the power of the militia, and indeed the physical force of the Nation of Islam would ultimately be used against him. Thanks for watching, make sure to subscribe to become an expert in the world around us, and stay tuned for the weekend where Enemies of the West leaves North Korea and instead heads to Uganda to look at the regime of Idi Amin. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.